Afternoon. Yeah, my name is Brad Romaine. I'm a coastal geologist by training. I'm extension faculty with the University of Hawaii Sea Grant program, and I work in a cost share position with the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources in their Office of Conservation and Coastal Land. So it's a little complicated, but I'm university extension faculty, but I spend most of my days downtown at the DLNR, Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands, where I help to coordinate the coastal lands program in that office. And that's the DLNR, and that office has oversight for beaches and coastal resources around the state. So I'm primarily involved in advising them in managing the care for our beach and coastal resources, deal a lot with erosion problems around the state, and help to coordinate with other agencies as well, not just the DLNR, but coordinating with agencies, with the communities, and with the university as well. Before I get into it, I spent my morning right there at Sunset Beach today. It was a beautiful day, just like that. Incredible surf and just a wonderful day. And I was trying not to think about work too much in my talk while I was out there, just trying to clear my mind and relax and surf. But one thing that did occur to me going into this talk was just what a magical and beautiful place Hawaii is, especially our coastlines. We have beautiful mountains and valleys and everything, but the thing that really struck me is just the draw, the magnetism that brings people here, both to live and to vacation. And most people, when they come here, they either to live or to, on vacation, want to be right up there on the coast. And so the last 50 years, it's been this pattern of developing dense development as close as we can to the shoreline. And it's had a lot of ramifications, both for our hazard resiliency, how exposed our communities are to hazards, and it also has a lot of ramifications on our natural resources, particularly our beaches. So that's really what this talk is about, on ways that hopefully we can improve both the management of our natural resources along the shoreline, also improving our resilience to coastal hazards. And if done correctly, those two goals can work hand in hand. So here we are, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Few dots in the middle of this blue marble. I put this on here because it really, I think, shows how exposed we are here in Hawaii to a range of natural hazards coming from the ocean surrounding us. We're the most isolated population center in the world, and we are the only island state in the nation, as you all know. And technically, all of our communities live within the coastal zone in Hawaii, so it makes us uniquely exposed to our hazards here in Hawaii. We're exposed to a range of natural hazards. Tsunamis, of course, shown here in the bottom left is the 1960 impacts of the Hilo from the tsunami. This one, I believe, came from that was the Chile one, yeah? Or was it Aleutians? Slips my mind right now. Anyways, I show this Hilo picture in particular because that was the second time that area of coastline was wiped out by tsunami. And it's one of the, as sad as that is, it is one of the best examples we have of this concept of managed retreat or managed realignment. They chose not to redevelop that area due to the repeat hazards. And it's a good example moving forward for not only tsunami, but other hazards we're facing in the future that, there may be some areas that we have to let lie and move out of. It may be the best management solution we have. But that's a case-by-case basis. We'll talk more about that. As we got a good reminder of this summer, we're very exposed to storms and hurricanes, not just tropical storms, but also weather systems in the North Pacific that come down and particularly tend to whack our typically leeward southern and western coasts with strong Kona winds and storms. And here's the 3 Category 4 storms we had in the central North Pacific. That's the first time anybody's ever observed that in North Pacific. 4 Category storms spinning there. This is a record year for us, fueled in large part by the warm waters around us from El Nino. We really dodged a bullet this summer, knock on wood. We'll probably be facing similar warm water temperatures next summer, but we were very lucky. But it was a stern reminder of how exposed we are to these strong storms passing through our area during hurricane season. So hurricanes and winter storms can bring not only storm surge, but also land-based flooding from heavy rains. This is Alamoana area. That's the convention center there. I think this was taken about, was it 2006 when we had that 40 days of rain, flooded a lot, Waikiki and a lot of our areas around Honolulu. Good afternoon. So I show this because we've chosen to build for a large part on this nice flat land that we have surrounding our islands, particularly here on Oahu. But it leaves us prone to flooding both from the ocean and from the seas, from the land, excuse me. We're also vulnerable to flooding just from elevated sea level. This is actually not runoff water coming out of this drain. That's seawater coming up out of the Alawai Canal on Alawai Boulevard there on one of our king tides. These are the highest tides we have every year. And at this point, it's just a small nuisance, not a serious impact, but we expect this to be a bigger problem with sea level rise in the coming decades. And I'll talk some more about that later on. These are some of these high tide events that we showing here that can lead to these kind of temporary nuisance flooding events. And then there's high wave overwash flooding, which is a major hazard along our built shorelines and beaches. This is Kailua Beach. I forget the exact year, but they called this the Backdoor Storm. It was a large winter storm that had an unusual east angle to it. So all of our coasts on Hawaii are highly exposed to large waves, as we all know, and this can lead to serious impacts when we get these high velocity overwash flooding from large waves. We generally know these areas that are prone to hazards. This is a portion of a Federal Emergency Management Association flood map. There's an online tool that's available. It shows the areas that are prone to terrestrial flooding in blue and purple here, stream flooding. And in particular, this red zone here is known as the VE zone, or high velocity flooding zone. And those are the areas that are exposed to tsunami and high wave flooding. They've mapped this both from modeling and then from observations over several decades. And unfortunately, this VE zone is typically the area that's most densely developed. You see these small postage stamp lots, completely built out to capacity, right up against the shoreline, as well as Kamehameha Highway running right through that zone as well. So we're already highly exposed without the specter of climate change and sea level rise, which again we'll get to some more in the coming talk here. I want to spend a particular amount of time on beach erosion. One, because that's what I studied in graduate school. It's what I end up doing a lot in my work with the Department of Land and Natural Resources and Sea Grant. But erosion is kind of unique among the hazards I've gone through here in that it's very difficult. In many cases, you can't recover from this hazard. It represents a permanent loss of land. The beach, the shoreline has been eroded away. If it's a chronic erosion problem, many times that beach or dune is not coming back. So we've increased our understanding of our erosion problems around Hawaii through a lot of mapping studies. And we've learned that about 70% of our beaches eroded over the last century. So the vast majority of our beaches are exposed to chronic or long-term erosion. Our shorelines retreated on average about 30 feet over the last century, which may not seem like a whole lot, but we have typically narrow beaches here in Hawaii, especially compared to our mainland shoreline areas. And many of our houses are built 20, maybe 40 feet from that shoreline. So it kind of starts to show how we're getting all these impacts with houses that are and other infrastructure that are threatened by erosion. We also lost about 13 miles of beach fronting coastal armoring. So typical response to erosion historically has been to put up a seawall or a rock revetment or some other engineered structure like that, which in many cases on an eroding beach will lead to complete loss of the beach. Erosion has impacts to private property, public infrastructure, as well as coastal access, recreation, cultural practices, coastal ecosystems, our natural ecosystems, as well as our tourism economy. Beaches are one of the key draws for our visitor economy. But you don't need a lot of data. You just got to look around the islands to see these impacts. This is east side Kauai, Ka'anapali, Maui, Sunset Beach, Oahu, fall winter of 2013. This was a highly publicized erosion event and one that I was personally really involved with in help with the DLNR, trying to advise them on ways to help these folks and help save the beach and dune in this very dire, difficult situation. This was a former swimming pool that was lost off the edge of the sand dune. I'll just point out this whole underlying area, underlying this house, is beach sand. It's dune sand, so they built these houses right out on the sand dune. And they're highly vulnerable. And then miles and miles of coastal highway around our islands. This happens to be Hanoa-Pi'ilani Highway on the way out to Lahaina. But Ka'ava, Honolulu, a lot of areas like this where we have low-lying highway that's highly exposed to beach erosion and wave overwash. And these problems are only going to get worse in the coming decades, it appears. And then critical infrastructure. This is a wastewater plant on North Maui near Kahului. They were, in the last couple of years, were forced to build a rock revetment, the footprint of which was placed in this gray area in response to ongoing erosion there and tsunami damage. Actually, they had some overwash in some portions of this from the Japan tsunami. So the prudent thing would have been to move this out of this hazard area, of course. But in this situation, the county determined it was cost prohibitive. It would have been $150 million or something, I think they estimated, to move this key piece of infrastructure. It serves Kahului and Wailuku for all their wastewater services. So for the time being, they felt the best thing to do would be protect it from a rock revetment, with a rock revetment. But as you can see, the beach has already been lost in this section. There's actually is a rock revetment in this section. They're extending it through here. So, all estimates point to this beach being incrementally lost along the new revetment section they built there. So it shows the trade-off that we have between protecting these critical facilities and preserving our natural resources, our beach resources. As I mentioned, we've gained a much better understanding of our erosion problem in Hawaii over the last several decades. Through a number of studies, particularly at the University of Hawaii Coastal Geology Group. This is where I did my graduate studies. And we created a series of maps, like this one shown for Sunset Beach. These maps are available for all the beaches around Kauai, Oahu, and Maui. The URL is right there. If you just search University of Hawaii Coastal Geology Group, you'll find a link to these maps, and you can check out the erosion rates for your favorite beach. And the results from these studies were then compiled in a report we did for the U.S. Geological Survey, the National Assessment of Shoreline Change. They're looking at shoreline changes around all the United States, and this was the contribution for Hawaii that we did, summarizing the results from these mapping studies around the three islands.
Is that not the one on the right?
That is, yeah. That was the cover, pretty picture. And this report is available it's an open file report available at the U.S. Geological Survey. If you search USGS National Assessment of Shoreline Change, you'll find that report. And again, through this report, we found that about 70% of our beaches around Hawaii are undergoing chronic or long-term erosion. All three islands have this overall trend of erosion. Particularly Maui stood out, though. 85% of beaches on Maui have this long-term trend of erosion. We'll talk a little bit more why that may be in a minute. The average shoreline change rate for all the beaches in the statewide study, 4 inches per year. May not sound like very much, but again, if you add this up, I told you 33 feet or so over a century, 17 feet over the last 50 years, which is most of our shoreline development has happened in that period. And many of our houses were set back only 20, maybe 40 feet from the shoreline. You can see why we're running into a lot of problems and impacts from coastal erosion. So that's the overall summary of beach erosion around Hawaii. But shoreline change is actually highly variable around our islands. And here's just an example from Oahu. The erosion areas along our beaches shown in red, and the accretion, or areas where the beaches are growing seaward, in blue. So they're not all eroding. Some are accreting, most of Kailua being a prime example of that. But we do have this overall trend of erosion, and these erosion mapping projects help us zero in on where these erosion problems are. And then many of the counties and other agencies use these maps just for general hazard assessment, but also for shoreline building setbacks and calculating those. And I'll show you those in a minute. So I mentioned that Maui was substantially more erosional than Kauai and Oahu, and we wanted to ask some questions. Why would that be? You know, one thing that stood out in addition to it being more erosional in Maui is that Maui has substantially more higher relative rate of sea level rise than Oahu does. And this is due in large part because Maui and the Big Island are actually subsiding under their own weight. Particularly the Big Island is subsiding into the lithosphere, the Earth's crust, under its own weight as it's growing with all this volcanic material and being added to it. And then Maui, a fairly young island, but still being kind of dragged down with the Big Island. There's this moat that runs around the Big Island and Maui, and then Oahu and Kauai are kind of out on the distal edge of that, and actually Oahu is fairly stable or maybe rising slightly. So there's a significant difference in the relative rate of sea level rise. So what we did with this study was we went through and controlled for other factors. Sea level rise is certainly not the only thing causing erosion in Hawaii. There's localized impacts, natural processes just such as sediment availability, coming in, a lot of our sand is coming in from the reefs or eroded from the dunes and feeding the beaches, but also human impacts. Things like sand mining. Sand mining was widespread, particularly on Maui on the North Shore, removing a lot of sand from the beaches for sugarcane industry, cement making. That practice was outlawed in the late 60s, but still had a lasting impact on our beaches. So with this study, we went through and tried to control for those human factors, particularly as best we could, and we found that Maui still stood out as substantially more erosional than the other islands when we remove those other human factors. And by all these estimates, our best summary was that sea level rise is a significant factor for the erosion trends that we see in Hawaii overall already. So it doesn't bode well for a future with increasing sea level rise, that it's already having a major impact here in Hawaii. And with this study, we also kind of confirmed a general rule that folks are finding with other similar studies, that for every foot of sea level rise, or every increment of foot sea level rise, you can have as much as 100 factor in the horizontal shoreline change. So if you get a foot of sea level rise, you can get as much as 100 feet of shoreline erosion or shoreline recession. So if there's a big multiplier effect from this vertical sea level rise and the horizontal shoreline change. As I mentioned, we've really built out on our low-lying coastal plains, Waikiki being an obvious example, but also on Sunset Beach. You can see these were originally single parcels here, and they've repeatedly subdivided them and built out to the absolute maximum footprint they can on these. And it's in particular left these houses very vulnerable, you know, originally 20 to 40 feet from the shoreline with the original setback. Now in many cases a few feet with that erosion I showed you, ongoing erosion problems we're having up there. And it leaves us with a real challenge as to how to deal with this. There's no room to move these houses back. The state and county governments have taken a particularly hard line against coastal armoring over the last decade or so, now understanding better the impacts on the beaches and beach loss from coastal armoring. So it leaves us with a real challenge in how to, you know, best protect the private interests while protecting the public beaches and beach access along here.
What's coastal armoring?
Coastal armoring would be a seawall or a rock revetment, anything to armor, hold the shoreline position in place there. So yeah, we built too close to eroding shorelines, and this is not just this chronic long-term erosion problem I showed you, but also these short-term seasonal changes we get, which is what this diagram is showing. You have a healthy beach, say through the summer, and you get large waves in winter. The waves scour away the dunes, feeding the near shore area. And in a healthy beach, that system will recover as the waves subside. But if you have a chronic underlying erosion problem, many times that beach won't recover, and you're left with a situation just like this, a house that was built in the sand dune, teetering on the edge with the seasonal and chronic erosion problem. And again, this is dune sand underlying this whole house, which is a few feet with its foundation from the edge of this precipice here.
May I ask a question?
Yeah, please.
Yesterday we went for a walk on Sandy Beach, and we were surprised at the sharp erosion right now there, you know. Now, is that just a common temporary normal thing, or is that permanent?
It is a common temporary thing. Our beaches, with both this long-term trends, they also have a lot of these short-term variability going on at different time scales. Hours with the tides, days to weeks with waves and wave climate through our seasons, and then longer years or so with El Nino and different climate cycles. So it makes it difficult to pick out these long-term trends because there is a lot of short-term variability like that. And when you see a steep drop-off like that, is that what you're describing? It usually means there was some wave event or some wave direction that scoured out one end of the beach like that. And very often we have a lot of these pocket beaches in Hawaii that are between two rocky headlands. You'll get one wave direction that will scour sand out from one end and move sand to the other. So they're these very dynamic and variable environments. And it really, again, kind of points out the fact that you need to kind of get out of the way of these areas and let them kind of breathe and move naturally. So I mentioned my job is at the Department of Land and Natural Resources as extension faculty with Hawaii Sea Grant. And a big part of my job is not only helping the DLNR deal with erosion and sea level rise issues, but working with other agencies to better coordinate and collaborate in these beach management problems. The issues with dealing with beach erosion, coastal management in Hawaii is particularly, we get another challenge, particularly because of all these overlapping jurisdictions we have. We don't have a integrated beach management program like they have in many other areas around the US and worldwide. We have these overlapping jurisdictions. The primary boundary is the certified shoreline, which is shown roughly here along the vegetation line. It's the annual high wash of the waves. It distinguishes the edge of these seaward property lines. Is also the landward edge of the county's jurisdiction, the special management area. So the county has jurisdiction landward of that line. The state, Department of Land and Natural Resources in particular, has jurisdiction seaward of that line, which is known as the conservation district. That land is all to be conserved in the public trust for the residents of Hawaii. On top of that, high water line showing here, you also have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the State Department of Health, which here in Hawaii, in particular, enforce the Federal Clean Water Act. So, and I should point out another one. This area, North Shore, Sunset Beach, the County Parks Department has jurisdiction over the beach as well. So they, through an executive order from the mayor, they also manage, in addition to their beach parcels, their beach park parcels, the shoreline, the beach through North Shore. So it makes dealing with these management challenges even more challenging, and it's a big part of my job is with the DLNR is helping to coordinate among these various agencies, which may have different perspectives, you know, trying to get everybody on the same page as how to deal with these problems. And with that, the natural beach environment, as I pointed out a few times already, doesn't recognize these man-made boundaries, extends right through these boundaries. These houses, I showed you some of the views from the beach, are built right on the top of the berm or upper dune in the beach environment.
So is there no hierarchy among these different organizations?
Don't really know how to answer that. It's really just whose jurisdiction something lands in, you know. Yeah, that's a tough one. The state does have jurisdiction. Again, it depends on who we talk to, but the state has primary jurisdiction from the shoreline out to the 3-mile limit, and then that's federal. But there's a Clean Water Act. It's really complicated as I'm trying to get across. Yeah. So I made the case already. Coastal erosion and flooding, these are already serious problems in Hawaii. But how severe? What are we looking at with the specter of climate change and rising sea level? Sea level is already rising around Hawaii. We only expect it to accelerate in the coming decades. What will be the impacts on our coastal resources and our communities? So we're beginning to look very careful at these coming issues and these accelerating problems. So CO2 is rising globally in our atmosphere from burning fossil fuels and changes in land use, agriculture, and other impacts around the planet. The correlation between CO2 and greenhouse gas emissions and global climate temperature is unequivocal. We've particularly we've had the 10 hottest years on record since 1998, and the hottest year on record was 2014. The hottest month on record was October of this year. So highly likely that we're headed for another record warm year this year, which is being fueled in part by El Nino globally. It actually has a global impact on warming. That's temporary, but it's adding to this long-term trend over this year. We're seeing the highest CO2 levels in the global atmosphere that we've seen in 800,000 years, possibly as long as 4.5 million years. And this data comes from ice cores. The previous slide I showed you comes from instrumental records. A lot of it is from instruments up on Mauna Kea that measures global atmospheric gas concentrations. But this data comes from ice cores from Antarctica and Greenland, where they can actually take bubbles out of the ice core and measure the gas content in the atmosphere at that time. So we are well above natural background records in the CO2. We are seeing accelerated rates of ice loss in Greenland and Antarctica. The two primary things that contribute to sea level rise on a global scale are land ice loss, so from these ice caps and glaciers around our planet melting off and running into our oceans, but also the water column actually expands as it warms. So a lot of the warmth that's gone into our atmosphere is actually getting absorbed by the oceans, and so global water temperatures are actually going up along with global atmospheric temperatures. And as that happens, the water column actually expands. So there's a component of the rising sea level rise that actually is from the water rising with this expansion factor. And this is leading to this overall global trend of sea level rise, which appears to be accelerating through this century and into the present. We're looking at under 1 millimeter in the early 1900s per year. That rate doubled in the middle 1900s to about 1.2 millimeters per year. More than doubled again in the past couple decades to 3.3 millimeters per year. And we may be on course to double that again. We looking at 4.4 millimeters per year since 2010. So the rate of sea level rise expanding globally. What does that mean for the future? Well, here's two projections from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. Shown here in red is the sea level rise trend from roughly the present projected out to 2100. This is their high range scenario. This is their estimate if we continue our expansion of greenhouse gas emissions as we are right now. That's known as the representative concentration pathway 8.5, their high end scenario. The blue is their lower end scenario, RCP 2.6, and that scenario was based on our global governments coming together and capping and then starting to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in this decade. So still questionable if we're going to get there. There's some hope after this Paris Climate Summit. I hope you've been following that. I'll talk a little bit more about that. But there was, so some of these numbers, the high end of this is looking at about 1 meter or 3 feet of sea level rise in the coming century, about 1 foot by 2050. And these two projections are actually pretty good agreement. So it looks like we're locked in for at least 1 foot of sea level rise by the middle of the century. More uncertainty as you go further out in time, but anywhere between 2 to 3 feet is likely, and possibly substantially more than that, given on our ability to mitigate our emissions of greenhouse gases. There was a study that came out from NASA this August, given that what we know now about how our oceans expand and how sea level rise behaves from ice melt runoff. This report said that it's pretty certain that we're locked into, regardless of how we mitigate our greenhouse gas emissions, locked into about 3 feet of sea level rise in this century. and possibly more. So that was a bit unnerving from a major study.
But that's in a century.
That's in a century.
But in, like, by 2050, I mean, this started at, well, they made this prediction 2015. I just wonder.
Oh, that was, yeah, no, that was the year of the study, right? Yeah, 2015. All these curves all, have a different rate of acceleration, rate of increase in emissions. And so that's where the underlying assumptions are. And that's why there's a lot of variability when you get out to 2100. But a lot of the science is saying that we should expect and plan for at least 3 feet, 1 meter of sea level rise over this century.
What has been the rise in the last century?
Matter of inches, 6, 8, 10 inches, something like that. I showed you the measurements. The plot I showed you before are actual measurements of sea level rise. If you add that up, it's 6, 8 or so inches, but we're seeing this acceleration, so we expect that rate to really increase. And then I showed you with that Maui study, it looks like even 6 or 8 inches can have a substantial impact on our beaches and shoreline environments, because as you get that kind of multiplier effect in the way our beaches respond by erosion. So what are we to do about all this? These coming problems. We already have these serious erosion problems. I only expect them to get worse. I know it sounds a little bleak. Let's talk about what we can do. There's 2 important terms to understand. Some of you are probably familiar with these. There's mitigation and there's adaptation. Mitigation really talks about how we're reducing our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions, and that's what this Paris conference is really about, trying to stop and then reduce the amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, methane, other things we're putting in the atmosphere. Then there's adaptation. Adaptation is how we respond to these impacts that we expect to see with climate change, including sea level rise. So, greenhouse gas mitigation. This is the mitigation part. I put this in. It's been a good weekend for this Paris talks. I think everybody in the community, the climate community, is still digesting what this all means. One quote I read is that that this is a good step forward. It's not a sealed, signed deal at this point. It's a chance at a chance to try to do the right thing. Here is another thing I read. There's a lot to be seen. Folks are still digesting this. China and the U.S. and I think India are the 3 big emitters. China is saying they're going to try to mitigate their emissions. The U.S. is saying the same thing. For the U.S., it's to be seen. The president is saying, well, I don't really need congressional approval to do this. They feel differently. We'll see how this all plays out. It's going to be interesting to watch. But anyways, the fact that the world was able to come together this weekend over the last 2 weeks and create this landmark deal is a big step.
And India said we plan to use as much coal as we need.
That's an issue too. That's the whole concept of climate justice. We already burned a lot of our coal and oil to develop this economy we have in the West. And they're saying, hey, what about us? We should be able to develop our economy just like you did. It's a tough argument. And a big part of what I understand the discussions with this Paris agreement was, how do we compensate folks for them having to limit, possibly their economic output? A lot of this stuff is still being sorted out. There's hope here at home, even though it'll have a limited impact globally. At least we're trying. The Hawaii Clean Energy Initiative, the governor signed this for 100% clean energy by 2045. Very ambitious. I think we get maybe, is it 10% or so of our energy from renewable resources now. But anyways, ambitious goal. Applaud them for that. And then there was a study that came out in 2015 that, in fact, for the first time in recent records, global greenhouse gas emissions are actually projected to level off or fall in this year. A lot of that is being attributed to China starting to move away from coal plants. I want a better understanding of this. From what I understand, they are building coal plants like gangbusters, but I guess the expected rate is maybe slowing down. So a little silver lining there. A little positive information on top of all this doom and gloom, which is important. I give a lot of these talks and it's like, oh man, I'm kind of depressed when I get out of them. So so there's some encouragement out there. So what is Hawaii doing locally for adaptation? How am I doing on time? I got a clock up there. Okay, we got till 4, right? Okay, leave some time for questions. All right. What is Hawaii doing locally for adaptation? In 2014, the governor and the legislature signed the Hawaii Climate Adaptation Initiative Act. This is Act 83. This act found that climate change is the paramount challenge of this century for Hawaii. The purpose of the act is to address the effects of climate change. And the initial focus of this act is to address the impacts of sea level rise. And this comes from, there's a lot of impacts from climate change other than sea level rise, potential impacts on public health, our natural resources, flora and fauna. Water resources are a big concern for climate change. But we decided we'd start with sea level rise. As I point out, we have pretty good information on the ongoing impacts, pretty reliable projections of what could happen in the future. There's a lot more question about what the impacts of health will be here locally. Anyways, we decided we could tackle something first. We went for sea level rise, and I've been really involved with the DLNR and the State Office of Planning in helping to begin this initiative act, and in particular developing this state sea level rise plan. So that's the first thing this act calls for, is developing a sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation report for the state of Hawaii. This is a report, not a plan, but looking at what are our vulnerabilities and making some recommendations of how we can better adapt to these coastal hazards that are going to be exacerbated by climate change and sea level rise. So the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Vulnerability and Adaptation Report is part of this Act 83 Climate Adaptation Initiative. With this report, through the state, we're compiling the best available science on climate change and sea level rise. We are projecting and modeling hazards exposure related to sea level rise, and we're working very closely with University of Hawaii researchers and others to model how increasing erosion and increasing flooding will impact our coastal resources and communities, and I'll show some more of that. And with that, we're going to be assessing our vulnerabilities to hazards related to sea level rise. How many roads are threatened by sea level rise related impacts? How many of our hotels and critical infrastructure and homes are threatened by these increasing impacts from sea level rise? And then the sea level rise report is intended to be a framework for further climate adaptation planning for the state. So looking at other things like health and water resources will provide a framework moving forward for planning for those other impacts. So as I mentioned, we're working closely with University of Hawaii researchers at the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology. So it's another big part of my job as Sea Grant Extension faculty. I kind of provide a bridge between the university setting, the researchers there, and state and local government. And one of the things we're working on is looking at sea level rise impacts. And this is what 3 feet of static, static sea level rise looks like in Waikiki and Ala Moana. The green areas being flooded areas with 3 feet of sea level rise, as well as the blue areas. So green, blue, flooding. Significant impacts. Now this is just a static rise. This doesn't account for storm flooding or terrestrial flooding from streams. This is just if you raise water level above high tide by a flat 3 feet. This is the impacts that we have. This is 4 feet. You can see the impacts, flooding from 3 feet to 4 feet of sea level rise. And this is something we find around Hawaii as we get more into this modeling with the UH researchers, and something that actually kind of pops up globally is that there's kind of this critical elevation, 3 or 4 feet, where you get a lot of cresting over the existing topography at the shoreline. You get a lot more impacts of flooding from static sea level rise. And then we're also modeling how erosion hazards will change with sea level rise. And this was a study that was from Tiffany Anderson at the University of Hawaii Coastal Geology Group that Department of Land and Natural Resources helped to sponsor. This study developed a model. It's a hybrid model that uses the erosion trends that we know about from all these erosion mapping studies. It combines those with an engineering model that describes how a beach profile theoretically evolves with sea level rise. In part, how I described how you can have that multiplier effect, 1 foot of sea level rise, 100 feet of erosion. That's a rough number, but that's the kind of engineering beach profile evolution models that are used here. So they combine these historical trends and projections using these engineering models and found that coastal erosion will double by the middle of the century with projected sea level rise. So things are only supposed to get worse as far as erosion. And by 2050, as much as 92% of shorelines are projected to be eroding or retreating. Yes.
On that slide that you showed just before this, the 3 feet and 4 feet. Now, the 3 feet is what they expect in a century. But I don't understand what the term static, how you use that. I don't understand the term.
It's kind of a theoretical flat water level that doesn't really exist, but if you didn't have any waves or other oceanographic effects that tend to vary sea level, we just talk about the waves. If you just minus out all the waves that are causing wave uprush and everything, and we're just able to raise a flat sea level, like filling up a bathtub along the shoreline, that would be this kind of static sea level rise. In reality, you have waves acting on top of that. You have occasional storm surge and other impacts like that. So it's kind of a theoretical water surface, but it's a good first look at what areas are low lying that are prone to flooding at that particular sea level height. And then with that, you have the tides going up and down. So it's much more complicated than that, but a good first look at what's vulnerable.
If 92% the 92% of the shoreline is eroding, where's it going? I mean, does it have to accrete somewhere, or is it just going out into the ocean, or what's the explanation for that?
This is talking about shoreline retreat. So it's shoreline retreat might be a more apt term there. Now that you asked that good question, the beach profile is adjusting both landward and upward. So some of the sand may be washed up and stored in dunes higher up on the profile. Some may be washed down into the near shore. Some of it will be, we have a lot of along-shore transport too, sand will be moved along-shore to offshore through those processes as well. So we're beginning to apply this model from that study to look at vulnerability and hazards along our shorelines for sea level rise. And this is just this is some early research and development outputs, but what it shows here is the present shoreline or vegetation line shown here in green, the yellow, orange, and reds being projected erosion hazards from 2030, 2050, 2070, and 2100. So you can see this projected erosion. These are erosion hazards. I'm sorry?
Where is that shoreline?
This is Eva Beach. And again, this is just research level stuff. We're working on how to apply this appropriately for the state vulnerability assessment, but clearly the front row or front couple of rows of homes in these areas are highly threatened. And then we're also modeling future wave overtopping. This is a model, again, research level product, but this is a model combining an annual high wave event. So what's the typical high waves we get on this coast throughout the year, plus 3 feet of sea level rise underneath that. And you can see once we get this 3 feet of sea level rise on top of that, how far these wave run-ups are going up into the community. This is coastal flooding from high waves washing over the shoreline at that 3 foot sea level rise. And so the state is going to be taking these models for different time frames. This is kind of the most extreme for 2100. We'll be looking at shorter time frames, 2050 and others, and overlaying them on maps to calculate what's vulnerable, how many miles of road, how many houses, how much critical infrastructure, how many critical facilities, to arrive at this overall assessment of what's vulnerable to sea level rise for this report. And then the other part of this report, not just looking at the vulnerabilities, but what are our options for addressing these growing hazards with sea level rise? The historical response to erosion has been to armor our shoreline. Again, armoring is seawalls and rock revetments and other engineered structures that are generally pretty effective at protecting private property, but can result in beach loss if the beach is chronically eroding or retreating towards these structures. And this photo kind of really depicts the typical impacts that we see from armoring around the state. You have a rock revetment that was placed some time ago in front of this property, has preserved the private property, and then immediately adjacent, but they've lost the beach in front of that. Immediately adjacent, they've chosen not to armor this shoreline. The beach is preserved because it's able to retreat and erode sand out from the dunes and coastal plain, but they've lost, I don't know what that is, 30, 40, 50 feet of land loss from that. So it's a tough trade-off. The state Department of Land and Natural Resources in particular is mandated to protect these beach resources from the state constitution, from DLNR rules. The natural beach resource and public access has been lost in front of this revetment here. So it's a big problem for a number of reasons. Lani Kai, not too far from here, being kind of one of the classic example of beach loss fronting coastal armoring, shown here in this picture. And again, overall, we've lost about 13 miles of beach over the last 50 to 100 years from coastal armoring. Rock structures, seawalls, and things like this placed to protect private property at the expense of the beach. So what are some of the tools that we have for trying to get development out of the way of these erosion problems? One of them is coastal building setbacks. The statewide minimum setback is 40 feet at this point. Kauai County and then Maui County and the Department of Land and Natural Resources are now, over the last few years, have developed these erosion rate-based setbacks. So what they do is they take the erosion rates from these erosion maps that I showed you and do a multiplier based on the expected lifespan of a home. In this case, for Kauai, it's 70 years. For Maui, it's 50 years. Then they add a buffer of 25 or 60 feet, and they use that to calculate how far back, based on the historical erosions, new development should go in to the shoreline. But this only applies to new development. It does not apply to existing development, particularly here on Oahu, where we've largely built out our shorelines. It's not really a highly effective tool in our bag of tools here. Other mitigation adaptations for coastal erosion measures that we can take: beach restoration, temporary erosion control with biodegradable materials, dune restoration. Shown here, bottom left, is Sunset Beach. In response to that erosion problem they've had lately, they're being allowed to restore their dunes with bulldozers and tractors. And then temporary erosion control with sandbags. Can be effective for a short time, but they really are a short-term fix, a Band-Aid. They don't really address the underlying problem. That's kind of really shown here by this sandbag revetment, where the beach is being lost in front of it, much as you'd see in front of a rock structure. Beach restoration. Some images from the Waikiki Beach Restoration Project in 2012. One option for mitigating erosion, addressing adapting to erosion, but it's expensive. It has potential impacts to the other natural resources, reefs and surfing resources offshore. It's logistically complicated. It's expensive. It really only makes sense in areas where it can be justified by cost. Waikiki is kind of a no-brainer for a lot of people. And this is a project that was managed by the Department of Land and Natural Resources. But this really still is just a short or mid-term solution. I don't really know how sustainable this is 40, 50 years out, when we're having accelerating erosion, accelerating beach loss. And it requires repeat nourishment. It requires a commitment from the agencies and landowners to keep this up at a lot of expense. What are other long-term adaptation options? So we looked at some short, mid-term adaptation options. What are our long-term options? There's a long list of them. I mentioned shoreline setbacks. I won't mention them all here. There's shoreline armoring. That may be appropriate in some areas, such as our urban corridors, Honolulu, things like that. maybe not so much for our more natural, pristine beaches around the islands. There's things called managed retreat or managed shoreline realignment, market incentives, conservation easements, this whole list of tools that we can apply that need to be applied on a site-specific approach. There's no one-size-fits-all approach for adapting to these coastal hazards, but there is a large bag of tools that we could apply. But a lot of these need further investigation about how best and where to apply them in Hawaii in particular. And our hopes is that this sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation report that the state is working on will be a first step towards that, identifying what the vulnerabilities are, providing high resolution spatial data of where our vulnerabilities are, and then allow the agencies and citizens to decide what's the appropriate adaptation option for each given piece of shoreline or each beach.
What does freeboard?
Freeboard refers to flood level. So it's how high you want to raise your house. So you see those houses on the North Shore that are on pillars, some of them. That's freeboard. They're designed to accommodate a flood or a tsunami by raising it above a flood freeboard, that's called. These adaptation options, that long list I showed you, are generally kind of grouped into three categories typically. Being accommodation, that's adaptation, things like increased shoreline setbacks, which I mentioned, siting and design standards for development, things like freeboard, structural retrofitting, maybe raising a house that's too low at this point. There's protection, hardening our shorelines in particular, hard solutions, seawalls, soft solutions such as beach and dune restoration. And then there's hybrid solutions, beach fill, and then adding groins and other engineered structures. I don't know if many of you have seen the Iroquois Point project that was out at Eva Beach, where they used a bunch of sand from the Pearl Harbor Channel, passed it back onto the beach, and then built a whole series of these T-head groins, building basically artificial little embayments to hold the sand in there. And then retreat or shoreline realignment. This is also often referred to. Limitations on new development on the shoreline, possibly acquisition of coastal land buyouts potentially, or things like tools such as transfer development rights, just to mention a few. Again, this is a whole tool set. It'll be very location specific, which ones are appropriate for each area. So that's what I have for today. Thank you very much. We got a little time for questions. I'd also like to direct you to all our websites, but particularly this one's new. This is climateadaptation.hawaii.gov is DLNR's new climate adaptation portal. And there's more information on the ongoing development of the sea level rise report, as well as broader information about climate adaptation planning in the state. So thank you. Yeah, any questions, please? Yeah.
All I would say is, wow. You know, and you did an excellent presentation. It's scary. But just specifically, like Hawaii, where they have the marinas and everything. We have a condo back up there, a few feet above the marina. But if the level rises on the coast, it's going to rise in the marina too, right?
Anything that's hydraulically connected to the ocean, and it's not just marinas, will certainly rise with the oceans. Another interesting impact is groundwater. So there's groundwater lens that comes down from the mountains and connects with the ocean. So if you drill down into the coastal plain and stick a well in there, you can actually see this groundwater level going up and down with the tides. And there'll be areas where, as sea level rises, it'll push this groundwater lens up and we'll get new wetlands. So it's areas that are currently dry that it'll start with reduced drainage. When we have a storm, those areas will drain more slowly, but eventually we'll have, if projections of sea level rise are correct, or we'll begin to have groundwater cropping out of some areas and actually creating new wetlands in some areas.
Maybe in your backyard, huh?
If you're low enough, yeah. Yes, please.
I went to Kailua Beach in the 40s, and it is much smaller now, and yet you show that it's accreting. When did that, it was eroding and now it's accreting? When did that change?
Well, overall, at least the northern 2/3 or so of Kailua Beach, the shoreline is pretty steadily grown seaward over the last century. It's not totally, that's not true for down in the beach park. They've had some much more acute erosion problems down in the southern end of the beach park. And we've been working with the Parks Department to try to mitigate that. But the northern 2/3 from the historical data does appear to be growing seaward. And it's not totally obvious when you're down there on the beach, because what's happening is the vegetation is moving out with the beach. It's, you know, it's pretty wet there on the east side. Next time you're down there, look, you'll see in the vegetation behind the beach these kind of low dunes, incipient small dunes that are starting to form, and there's young vegetation creeping out on them. That's another sign that the beach is growing seaward. Now, with sea level rise, we don't know how long that'll keep up. Projections are probably that it'll start to slow down the erosion and start to slow down the accretion and turn to erosion. When that'll be exactly is kind of for modeling to figure out. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Question.
Oh, yeah, let me get her in the back, and I'll come back to you. Yeah, please.
I'm so sorry I was late and missed having.
Were you stuck on Kalaniana Highway? Yeah.
No.
Oh, I was. I barely made it here too.
Is there anything like if you do the planting of the alpaca, does that help prevent the erosion? Because I noticed like on Fort Lock, they're starting to plant there. I don't know if it's to keep out the people or if it's actually for erosion purposes.
It's some of both. It's kind of a mixed bag. If there's a chronic erosion problem, meaning the beach is steadily receding landward, it's not going to help. You'll see that vegetation get washed out eventually. If there's a seasonal problem, if you use the right species of vegetation, like aki grass and the other native dune species we have, could be somewhat effective in some low energy environments. A lot of our town areas, those naupaka hedges you've seen are really a privacy barrier, to be honest. And the state, that's another problem for the state. The beach is actually considered a transit corridor, much like a highway or a sidewalk. And there is rules that long shoreline access has to be maintained. And the state has been proactively enforcing vegetation removal from folks that are kind of blatantly growing their hedges and stuff out on the beach. Yes, you had a question.
If the groundwater and the salt water interact at some point, does that mean we can get salt in our drinking water?
Potentially. And that's a real worry for low-lying atoll islands in the South Pacific, Marshall Islands and places like that, where they're at maximum 8-10 feet above sea level. And the islands are made largely out of sand and gravel and coral material. They have a very thin freshwater lens, and if seawater gets into that small freshwater lens, they can lose their freshwater resources. Not a huge worry here for Hawaii. We're lucky to live on high volcanic islands where most of the fresh water is coming down from the mountains in streams, but also in our groundwater, percolating down through the lava rock. So most of our wells I think our drinking wells are located well up the hillsides, and we can always move them up. So I think we're okay in that regards overall.